Good morning, everyone. My name is Menno Ettema. I work as coordinator of the No Hate Speech Movement campaign in Strasbourg, and I would like to start with saying sorry that I can't be with you in person, because I think your event today is a wonderful opportunity actually to reflect on the work that has been done, and I think it can be a very insightful event, and I really look forward to hearing from the results. I've been asked to give a quick review of what has the campaign already achieved till now, and where did it start and where are we now, and then have a look at the present activities of the campaign and the outlook for the campaign in the future, and link it also to the work of the Council of Europe as it is now. So maybe to start with the review of the campaign till now, it's probably good to recall that the campaign started already in 2012, which is some time ago now, following the dramatic events in Norway with the Utøya attack, and also the aftermath of the online support for the Breivik, and also ongoing support for the anti-Semitic and hate speech that we saw there. It's also related to the incidents of cyberbullying that were reported at that moment, and the effect that it had on young people, including quite drastic effects as suicide. It was actually the youth section of our steering bodies, the Advisory Council on Youth, that realized that our work that we are doing in the youth department and in the youth sector as such on anti-discrimination and on human rights was missing a gap with the online world, that online world has really integrated in the offline world for young people, and that here human rights somehow didn't, and anti-discrimination work that we've been working on a lot did somehow not apply. We noticed there was a gap and this needed to be taken up. So that's where the campaign started, the No Hate Speech movement. And to reflect a little bit on the achievements, I think the first thing we need to say is that we have a much better understanding now, after 3 years, of what we are talking about when we're talking about hate speech. And the recent accepted recommendation of the ECRI number 15 on hate speech is, I think, an example of that, of the progressing knowledge about hate speech, and the campaign has certainly contributed to that. So that's one major achievement that I think we should be very proud of and we should celebrate. We also have to conclude that nowadays hate speech and online hate speech and its expressions is totally on the political agenda, which was not the case in 2012. Sadly, there are a lot of negative events in Europe with the terror attacks lately that actually supported this realization that hate speech online is a serious issue that needs to be addressed. And just like in 2012, it's very negative effects that has mobilized the forces to actually work on this topic. Nonetheless, I think it's an achievement that it is now recognized, and that the campaign, for example, is being prolonged, because as you probably know, it was planned to finish in 2015, but it's now been prolonged, and I think that is also partly a political recognition of the significance of the campaign, and that should not be forgotten. The campaign managed to reach out to a lot of different publics. It was a youth campaign. It started from the youth sector, but it now involves many different NGO sectors, minority groups, different ethnical groups, political parties, political movements, you name it, it's all there. So I think it is youth started but widely embraced. And because of that, we can now also build on a really big and a strong network of committed actors. And I think that's one of the strengths that the campaign now has. Also looking forward, I think this is a strength and achievement that we can build on, and we should build on. And I invite you to reflect on that today. Linked to this, the campaign is now is an example of cross-sectorial cooperation. It's not only a youth campaign. Other NGOs who are working on Roma rights, for example, or LGBT rights, gender rights, are all involved, including political processes. And I think this is also very important and a possibility and an opportunity that we should harness. Now, another point is, I think, what we really need to celebrate today, and I invite you to actually celebrate when you're reflecting on the achievements, is that this campaign started from scratch. We weren't really sure what to do and how to set up an online campaign against online hate speech. But now I think we have learned a lot, and we can actually say that we know better what we're doing and how we should be doing, and we should continue that work. So that's an achievement. And one of the major players in this achievement is you, the national youth council, the the national campaign committees, which includes the National Youth Council, of course. So the national campaign committees are very important in this work, and have really managed to adapt the campaign to the national realities and to bring in the national concerns and issues and adapt the campaign message to something that works in the national context. So this is something that I want to thank you in Poland and in the National Campaign Committee for doing this. And Poland has been mentioned in several occasions in the European context as a positive example of how this cooperation between NGOs, civil society, governmental partners, ombudspersons, etc. can be achieved, educators, youth workers, teachers, etc. And that comes me to the last point. I think one of the major achievements that has really been acknowledged is the educational aspect of the campaign. The campaign is really built as a human rights educational response to hate speech online. And I think this needs to be further developed and strengthened and needs to be acknowledged. And I'll come back to that later. The bookmarks manual is being translated in more and more languages, and it's also being integrated in school curriculum, for example, in various countries. And this is really a key success. And it's also important to realize that this is a very essential preventive nature of the campaign. The campaign is maybe not so directly about dealing with radicalization and things like that. It's really a preventive campaign to provide young people with the opportunities to say no to hate speech online. This is not what I want, and respond in a different way. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So these are some of the achievements that are reached and we should celebrate. And I hope you will do that and also reflect for yourselves today on what have you achieved and why was that successful? What is there to keep and strengthen? And I also invite you really to report back to the European level of your achievements, because I think we can all learn from each other in this way and sharing good practices. And Poland has been an example in many ways, and so we look forward to receiving your feedback of the day and your learning from the campaign till now. Now, as I mentioned, I think it's important to restate why this is a flagship event of the flagship project of the Council of Europe. I met the Secretary General of the Council of Europe about 4 weeks ago, and we talked about the campaign, and he restated that for him this is a flagship project of the Council of Europe because of its strength, because of its grassroots strength, and because of its preventive nature through human rights education. And it links to many of the other works that the Council of Europe is doing, promoting human rights online, promoting human rights, promoting democracy, promoting the rule of law. And the campaign does all this in many, many ways. So what's happening now at the Council of Europe that you might want to, which you should be aware of? Of course, there's the European Committee Against Racism and Intolerance, the ECRI, who has adopted recommendation number 915 on hate speech. This is a very important recommendation. It has very clear guidelines to member states on how to address hate speech. And I understand this will be explained in much more detail later today, so I'll stop here. But I really encourage you to use this recommendation to see and how to work on the topic of hate speech and put recommendation into practice also in the Polish context. Another key development in the Council of Europe at this moment is the Council of Europe strategy on internet governance, which has just been adopted 2 weeks ago, and I encourage you to have a look at it if you can still today. It's trying to promote, one of its key things that it's trying to promote is actually human rights online as a key underlying factor in the document, and how the different departments and divisions of the Council of Europe and all its partners can actually work to achieve this. The strategy calls for dialogue between governments and companies, internet companies, and also civil society to take part in this in this governance discussion, in this dialogue on internet governance, to be active partners in this. The strategy calls for a standard setting on how freedom of expression should be regulated and be related to, for example, blocking harmful content or filtering content or even taking it down altogether. So how was these relations working? This again is governance questions, which I think civil society should be part of. Young people who are really the active users of internet should be part of this debate. And therefore, Also, this strategy on internet governance calls for education, educational media literacy, and I think linked to this, human rights education for online human rights education. And then the last point is the question, for example, how do I readdress human rights of when they're violated online as an internet user? There are questions here. How do I monitor? How do I report human rights violations online? There's many questions here which the campaign has also been trying to address, and this needs to be pushed back into the strategy. Now, with all these strategies and recommendations, there's a lot about how do we go from recommendation to action? And that's a question I have for you today. How can we move these kind of instruments that the Council of Europe has into practical action? What should this look like in the Polish context and in the European context as a whole? It's also a good moment maybe to recall the many other aspects of the Council of Europe. Council of Europe is really on policy setting and standard setting, providing guidelines to member states on how to implement human rights, democracy and the rule of law. So it's good maybe today to review some of the other work that the Council of Europe is doing in many, many areas, which might connect well to the topics that you want to pick up on the campaign for the next 2 years. For example, you could look at the new thematical action plan on the inclusion of Roma and travelers, which has also been adopted about 2 weeks ago. And linked to that, the Roma Youth Action Plan, which is being developed and will be adopted in about 2 months or 3 months from now. The Council of Europe also has a document on standards and mechanisms addressing sexual orientation and gender identity, which could be very insightful and useful to use. Or, for example, the Council of Europe Gender Equality Strategy. And linked to that, of course, the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. This convention specifically, I think, is a very useful tool because it already refers to online harassment, online sexual grooming and more of those concerns where sexism and sexual violence is actually addressed in the online space. So it's a very useful tool in campaigning aspects and also in education. So I would really encourage you to use these documents. Knowing that these documents exist, the question of course is, okay, what does the campaign do now in the next 2 years? So it's important to mention that the campaign has been prolonged as part of the Council of Europe Action Plan on addressing radicalization that leads to violent extremism and terrorism. Now, the campaign is not included here as a response to radicalization directly. The campaign is included as a preventive measure to actually prevent the pool of radical ideas or the pool of violent extremism towards the general youth population. So the campaign is very much a preventive campaign. And through human rights education, we're trying to promote that young people actually understand that there are alternative solutions to very real existing challenges that young people face in Europe today. I mean, we should be very clear. There are lots of challenges for young people today of access to housing, access to employment, and you name it. And there's a disengagement in the political process. Now, this might lead to all kinds of questions with young people. And how do we respond to these questions? Through a human rights paradigm and a democratic paradigm, a narrative for human rights and democracy. So this is what human rights education can do, and this is what we should be doing, and this is how the campaign is also seen in this action plan. In addition to this, the Council of Europe has an action plan on inclusive societies, which is a response to the refugee crisis of last year, and puts a lot of questions to Europe as how we integrate and actually become a multicultural society and integrate and be inclusive to all. So the priorities for the campaign for the next 2 years in light of these action plans is still education. It's a major pillar and we continue working on that. But now that we've done education and awareness raising, the second priority is also to enhance reporting. The Hate Speech Watch, which will be explained later today, will be renewed and further strengthened, and will also include guidelines on how to report at national level. But it's not only about reporting for legal action, it's also reporting to actually publicly state that we push out or we denounce this hate speech. We don't want this in our public space. So how do we support young people to actually report hate speech and say, listen, this is what I don't like and I want it not here. Related to that, we need to support young people to actually send out an alternative message to what we call counter-narratives. When they come across hate speech, to say, listen, I don't agree with this and this is why A, B and C. So this is what we would call providing an alternative narrative, a counter-narrative to the hate speech narrative. And this counter-narrative should of course be a human rights narrative and a narrative to democracy. We will be developing in the next few months a handbook for educators and youth workers on how to develop counter-narratives to hate speech. It will be published around September, and I encourage you to look into it and see if you could translate it and actually integrate it in your human rights education work and link it to bookmarks. Of course, naturally, we will be continuing our work on promoting youth participation in internet governance, and I've just been covering that. There are also 3 thematical areas that we're going to pick up because we believe it's been too little addressed. One is anti-Semitic hate speech, which is clearly on the rise and not being denounced, which we need to address. Another point is sexist hate speech, which is predominantly everywhere. It's targeting 50% of the world population, but it's very little understood and addressed and taken serious, so we want to put action on that. And hate speech targeting refugees and migrants, we want to deal with that. So these are the 3 thematical areas. But of course, we invite you to take up other thematical areas that are very relevant in Poland or maybe in the region. So these thematical areas are the topics we want to address at European level, but it doesn't exclude you to take up the issues that are very relevant in the Polish context. I would like to underline that. And please let us know what you want to do so that we can also highlight that in our European communications. So I'll close here with saying also that one of the things we learned from the campaign till now is that we should have less action days during the year, but more concentrated. So we will have 5 action days this year. One we already had on the 8th of March against sexist hate speech. The second one will be on the 20th of June, addressing, which will be focused on supporting refugees targeted by hate speech. The 22nd of July will be an action day for the victims of hate crime. On the 9th of November, we will have an action day to combat anti-Semitic hate speech. And on the 10th of December, we will have an action day on human rights online and internet governance, for example, youth participation. So I invite you already today to have a look at these dates and say, okay, what can we do for these days in Poland, specifically, for example, for the 20th of June and 22nd of July, which are coming up very quickly. You can expect a concept paper on these topics later at the end of next week. So keep that in mind and please start thinking already what you could do and share that with the Secretariat so we can also take up your ideas in the communication with all the other national campaign committees. This is it for me. I wish you a wonderful day. I hope that creativity will boil. I know that the Polish campaign has done a lot and to celebrate, and I really invite you to celebrate and enjoy the achievements that you had, to share such good practices. Don't keep them for yourself. Let us learn from what you've done and think bravely about the future and connect to the campaign and see what you can do in the Polish context, what needs to be done next, and take it from there. Let me know. I look forward to your feedback and to your ideas and to meet you hopefully very soon in person in the next event. Have a wonderful day and thank you.